The rock fell out of a clear sky, which was the part nobody could explain later. No meteor shower was scheduled. No comet was passing. The tracking rays at Goldstone had picked up nothing inbound. And when the crater team from the University of Adelaide drove out to the paddock where the thing had landed, a dry slab of red earth 40 kilometers from Broken Hill, they found the impact zone unremarkable. Small crater, maybe 2 meters across, scorched grass at the rim. The object itself, partially embedded in the clay, roughly the size of a basketball, still warm to the touch when Dale Morrow arrived with his sample kit and his headache. He'd been having the headache for 3 days before the meteor even fell. That was the other thing nobody could explain. Dale was 32 and worked for the Geological Survey on a 3-year contract that was almost up. He was not the kind of man people described as exceptional. He was the kind of man people described as reliable, which is a word that sounds like a compliment until you realize it means no one expects anything remarkable from you. He had a degree he'd worked hard for, a truck that needed new shocks, and a shelf of books about places he hadn't visited yet. He was the sort of man the universe tends to overlook, which, as it turned out, was either a terrible mistake or a deliberate calculation, and he was never entirely sure which. He crouched over the object in the clay and felt the heat coming off it against his palm. Not dangerous heat, almost comfortable, like a stone that had been sitting in afternoon sun. He took out his field notebook and wrote down the dimensions. Color, dark basalt grey, surface slightly iridescent. The impact angle. He photographed it from 6 positions. He did everything correctly and by the book, because that was what Dale Morrow did. Then he looked at the crack running along its equator. Something was inside, something geometric. The crack had split the rock along a seam that was far too regular to be natural, a hairline fracture that ran perfectly straight for exactly 18 centimeters, turned 90 degrees, and ran straight again. He stared at it for a long time with the sun behind him and the flies buzzing around his ears. He was alone out here. Crater team wasn't due until morning. He took out his geological hammer and opened the rock. The object inside was the color of old ivory, approximately 30 centimeters across, and shaped like nothing he'd seen in any catalogue or database or photograph. It curved like a partial sphere, textured with a raised pattern that could have been circuitry or could have been script. He couldn't decide which, because his eyes kept sliding off it, the way eyes slide off optical illusions. There were contact points on the inner surface, spaced in a configuration that matched, with uncomfortable precision, the spacing of the temporal and occipital bones of a human skull. He knew this because he'd done a semester of anatomy in his 2nd year on a whim between geology electives. It had seemed irrelevant at the time. He picked it up anyway. He was wearing latex gloves. He told himself it was sample handling protocol. The headache went away the moment the object was in his hands. Not gradually, instantly, like a switch thrown. He sat in the crater 20 minutes, just holding it, feeling the absence of pain the way you feel the silence after a long noise. He finally stood up and walked back to his truck. He set it on the passenger seat beside him. He told himself he would log it properly when he got back. He told himself he was just being careful about contamination. He did not log it when he got back. He drove to his rented house in Broken Hill and sat at his kitchen table and looked at the object until midnight, and then he put it on his head. That is the only honest way to describe what he did. The contact points met the bones of his skull with a faint click, like a plug finding its socket. The pattern on the surface shifted. He saw it in his peripheral vision, slow rotation of geometries that didn't quite resolve into meaning. And then something came through. Not language, not images. Sensation, more than anything. The feeling of tremendous distance. The feeling of patience so deep it registered as geological. And beneath both of those, bass notes through a floor, something very like interest. He took it off and sat breathing in his kitchen for a long time. Outside, the stars were the densest he'd seen all year. He put it back on. This went on for 6 days, and in those 6 days Dale Morrow learned 3 things. First was that the object was a transmission device, not a receiver, a transmitter. Every time he wore it, he was broadcasting. His thoughts, his memories, his understanding of human biology and language, and the layout of his town and his country and his planet. Everything he knew. The object was not giving him anything. It was reading him like a book and sending the text somewhere. Second was that the object had been spent deliberately. The headache he'd felt before the rock fell was not coincidence. Something had been targeting him specifically, looking for a mind of a particular type, particular training, particular location. Alone enough to be isolated, knowledgeable enough to be useful, curious enough not to run. The third thing he learned was that they were coming. He learned this on the 6th day when he put the object on one final time and felt very clearly the edge of something enormous moving through interstellar space with the unhurried certainty of a thing that has never, in all its existence, encountered meaningful resistance. He took the object off and set it on his kitchen table. He went to his bathroom and looked at himself in the mirror for a while. Then he picked up his phone and called the one person he thought might actually listen. Her name was Dr. Patience Adderwale, and she worked at the CSIRO in Sydney on radio astronomy projects that nobody in the general public paid much attention to. He'd met her at a conference 2 years ago and they'd argued pleasantly for an hour about whether the WOW signal was more likely an instrumentation artifact or a genuine stellar source. He'd liked her because she hadn't dismissed either possibility. She had the particular kind of scientific mind that finds uncertainty interesting rather than distressing. "I found something," he said. She picked up. "I know," she said. "I've been detecting anomalous transmissions from your coordinates for the last 4 days." Was a silence. "I was going to call you," she said, "but I didn't know how." He drove to Sydney. He brought the object in a styrofoam sample case padded with foam sheeting, which felt somewhat inadequate given the circumstances, but he didn't have anything better. Patience met him at her facility at 2 in the morning, and they spent the rest of that night and all of the next day running every test she could think of on both the object and on Dale's current neurological state. The results were not reassuring. "It's been mapping you," she said at some point near sundown, both of them eating takeaway noodles in her lab and looking at the scans on her screen. "Every exposure builds a more complete model. It's like building a dictionary. It needs a sufficient vocabulary before it can say anything coherent." "Say anything to them," Dale said. "Or say anything to me." She looked at him both. He thought about this. "How long do we have?" She pulled up a trajectory model she'd been building from the transmission vectors. She'd been quiet about that part. Turned the screen to him. He looked at the model for a long time. 6 weeks, said, give or take. He put down his noodles. Right? They worked for 4 weeks before they told anyone else. This was either heroically rational or catastrophically arrogant, and Dale never entirely made peace with which. The problem was the object, specifically what they'd learned about what it was actually doing when worn. It wasn't just mapping Dale. It was training itself on him, learning to simulate him, and through that simulation, learning to model the rest of humanity. By the 3rd week, they understood that the incoming civilization, they were careful not to call them anything else because language shapes thought and they needed to think clearly, had done this before, many times. They found the echoes of it in the transmission patterns, at least 11 distinct biological templates, all different, none of them human. This was a methodology. You sent a probe, you found a mind, you mapped the species through the individual. You arrived knowing exactly who you were dealing with. It was, Dale had to admit, deeply efficient. They expect to step off the ship knowing us completely, Patience said on a Tuesday evening in week 3. She was at the whiteboard, drawing signal diagrams, knowing our response patterns, our social hierarchies, our emotional levers. They'll arrive knowing how to talk to us, knowing what we're afraid of. So we use that, Dale said. She turned around. What we put in, he said. We choose what we put in. He'd been thinking about this for a week. He'd been wearing the object every night, letting it read him and being deliberate about what he thought about when it did. He'd been filling himself with things. Old memories of his grandfather's hands teaching him to tie knots, the sound of rain on a tin roof, the particular stubborn pleasure of solving a problem that has no obvious solution, the memory of being 11 years old and reading about the first moon landing and feeling that the world was fundamentally interesting in a way that made all hardship secondary. He'd been feeding the object a picture of humanity, and he'd been choosing the frame. They'll arrive knowing us, he said. But they'll know us the way we choose to be known. Patience looked at him for a moment, then pulled up a chair. Show me what you've been giving it, he told her. All of it. The images he'd held in his mind during exposure, the memories he'd deliberately surfaced, the specific things he'd let himself feel while the object was reading him. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he valued most about her. When he finished, she was quiet for a bit. There are other things they need to know, she said finally. What things? That we understand sunk cost, that we know when a fight has become unprofitable, that we can recognize a loss and recalibrate instead of doubling down. She paused. Most of the things that make us seem worth defeating also make us seem worth avoiding. He hadn't thought of it that way. You think they'll decide we're not worth the trouble. I think, she said carefully, that a civilization capable of interstellar travel at that speed is almost certainly not interested in conquest for its own sake. They're interested in what's useful. And the most useful version of us is the one that can be dealt with as a peer rather than managed as a problem. So we make ourselves look like a problem that solves itself. We make ourselves look like the kind of problem that has a solution they'd prefer over the alternatives. He thought about that for a long time. We have 2 weeks, he said, I know. They brought in 4 others at that point. Patience picked them herself. A linguist who specialized in constructed languages, a xenobiologist who'd spent 20 years preparing for exactly this category of event and was frankly relieved it had arrived, a retired military systems analyst who looked at the transmission patterns and immediately began drawing worst-case scenarios on a legal pad, and a cognitive scientist who had a theory about non-human reasoning architectures that her colleagues considered eccentric and which now appeared distressingly correct. They met in Patience's lab and they spent 48 hours going through everything. The military analyst, a small, careful woman named Torres, who had the habit of tapping her pen on her thumbnail when she was thinking, looked at the trajectory data and said, very quietly, we cannot stop their arrival, we cannot intercept, we cannot deflect, cannot get anything into that corridor in time. So stop assuming that's an option. Nobody argued with her. What we can control, she said, is the first 30 seconds of contact. What they've already received and what they receive when they step out. Those 30 seconds determine every subsequent event. Not military capability, not resource distribution, not population numbers. 30 seconds of framing. That's what we've been working on, Dale said. Torres looked at him. She had a way of looking at people that felt like a structural assessment. Describe it. He described the controlled exposure protocol. He'd been feeding the object, the deliberate curation of human experience, not propaganda, not a highlight reel, but something more precise than that, the specific texture of what it felt like to be a species that had been knocked down repeatedly and kept getting back up, not because it was invincible, but because it was constitutionally incapable of deciding it was beaten. Torres tapped her pen. And the object is transmitting this now? Every time he wears it, Patience said. What's the signal lag at current distance? Linguist looked up from his notes. Based on the vectors, about 11 days. Torres did the arithmetic. So they've been receiving a modified feed for 9 days, Dale said. Torres nodded slowly. They've been recalibrating their model of us for 9 days. They'll arrive with a different picture than they intended. That's the hope. That's not a plan, she said. That's a prayer with math behind it. I know, Dale said. It's what we have. She looked at him for a long time. All right, she said. Then let's make the math as good as it can be. The last 2 weeks were the strangest of Dale's life. was saying something given the previous 4. They worked in rotating shifts, sleeping on cots in the break room, eating whatever someone had time to order. The cognitive scientist built a model of what the incoming civilization would likely infer from various data packages. The linguist worked on structural patterns in the transmission signals, trying to determine whether any meaningful information had already come back the other way, and on day 9 found a faint echo in the carrier wave that might have been a response or might have been noise, and which none of them were able to resolve before the ships arrived. Ships, plural, 3 of them, coming in on a trajectory that gave 3 days of visible approach for atmospheric insertion. The world's radio telescopes saw them simultaneously. The world's governments did what governments generally do when confronted with something outside their existing frameworks, which is to say they convened committees. And the committees spent the first day arguing about jurisdiction, and by the second day everyone had understood there was no framework and the argument stopped and something very close to genuine fear settled in. Dale watched the approach on patients' screens and felt, oddly, less afraid than he expected. He wasn't sure if that was because of the work they'd done, or because he was too tired to be afraid properly, or because somewhere in 4 weeks of sitting with the worst possible outcome he'd made a certain kind of peace with uncertainty. He thought it was probably all 3. Object sat on the table beside him. He hadn't worn it in 48 hours. Whatever was going to be received had been received. Ever happens, patient said at some point in the final hour, not finishing the sentence. Yeah, he said. The ships did not land. They held position at 18 kilometers altitude, high enough to be out of range of everything, low enough to make the point clearly. They were large. Larger than anything he'd expected from the data. The live feeds from aircraft and satellites showed structures that seemed to have been designed by a mind that thought about space the way a sculptor thinks about it. Not as empty volume to be filled, but as a medium to be worked with. They were almost beautiful in a way that was entirely unlike anything human and made no reference to human aesthetics, which made them somehow more beautiful than if they'd tried. The transmission came 4 hours after atmospheric insertion. It came through every radio receiver on Earth simultaneously. It came in 1,100 human languages, translated with an accuracy that would have taken human linguists decades to achieve, and which the incoming civilization had apparently managed from a dead stop on the basis of 6 weeks of data. This was the first demonstration. This was them showing they had done their homework. The message was not a demand. It was a question. Specifically, it was a question about a memory. Dale's memory, transmitted and received and apparently found to be. The word the linguist used, after 3 hours of analysis, was diagnostic. The question referenced a specific image. An 11-year-old boy sitting on a back step in the summer dark, reading about the first lunar landing by torchlight, because his grandfather had told him men were on the moon, and he hadn't believed it until he read the accounts himself, and then he'd sat outside to look at the moon and thought that the world was vaster than anything he'd been told, and that this, not terrifying but purely deeply good. They wanted to know, was this representative, not of that specific individual, of the species? Dale sat in the lab and looked at the question on the screen for a long time. Then he looked at Torres and Patience and the linguist and the xenobiologist, who was very quietly crying, and the cognitive scientist, who was furiously writing. "What do you say?" Patience asked him. He thought about his grandfather's hands, about rain on a tin roof, about 1,100 languages carrying the same message simultaneously was itself a kind of answer, wasn't it? The fact that they'd learned 1,100 languages before they asked a single question. He thought about the thing Torres had said, about the first 30 seconds, and how they'd already spent 6 weeks on those 30 seconds without knowing it, and how perhaps the 30 seconds that actually mattered weren't arrival at all, but this moment when something that had travelled enormous distance and carried enormous capability chose, before any other action, to ask a question instead of make a statement. thought about what patients had said about being a problem that has a solution. He put the object on his head one last time. He thought very clearly and very deliberately about yes. Not a complicated yes, not a qualified yes. The plain, unambiguous yes of someone who has looked at the question honestly and found the answer is both obvious and true. The kind of yes that knows the next question will be harder and the one after that harder still, and is all right with that, because the alternative to harder questions is no questions at all, and that is a much worse thing. He felt the object read him. He felt the distance. He felt the patience that was geological, deeper than continents, older than the planet's current configuration. He felt it receive him. He took the object off and set it on the table. 3 hours later, the ships descended to 8 kilometers and held. Not lower, not higher. 8 kilometers, which the cognitive scientist spent 90 minutes analyzing before she looked up from her notes with an expression that was difficult to read. It's a negotiating altitude, she said. It means they came to talk. How do you know? Torres asked. Because they came in over the ocean, she said. If they weren't interested in negotiation, they'd have come in over a capital, over a military installation, over something they wanted us to understand they could reach. She paused. The ocean means they want neutral ground. It means they picked something that doesn't belong to any of us. Dale sat back in his chair. He was very tired. The headache, he noticed, was completely gone and had been gone for weeks, and he thought probably it would not return. So what do we do now? The xenobiologist asked. Nobody answered immediately. The screens showed the 3 ships hanging in the atmosphere over the Southern Ocean, lit by the sun at low angle, their surfaces catching the light in ways that shifted with angle and time, and suggested materials not found in any human periodic table. Do what we've been doing, Dale said finally. We make the math as good as it can be. He looked at Patience. She looked back at him. Going to need a bigger team, she said. Yeah, he said. Outside, on the other side of the planet, the ships waited. They had come an enormous distance. They had the patience of astronomical time and the capability of a civilization that had watched 11 species for this one navigate this exact moment. They had arrived knowing humanity in extraordinary detail, its history, its failures, its remarkable and unreasonable persistence, the specific texture of its stubbornness and its grief and its humor and its tendency, when faced with the genuinely terrifying, to want to understand it rather than run. They had arrived knowing a species that would, given the choice between being afraid and being curious, choose curious. They had decided, apparently, that this was worth a conversation. Dale Morrow drove back to Broken Hill 3 days later to collect the rest of his things. He'd been offered a position he hadn't quite agreed to yet, attached to a team whose mandate didn't quite exist yet, working on a problem that had no precedent. He stopped on the way at the paddock where the crater was. It had been roped off now, surrounded by equipment and personnel. He showed his credentials and they let him through. He stood at the rim for a while. The clay was still slightly darker there. The grass hadn't grown back. He thought about the object, which was now in a secure facility in Sydney, being studied by people with more specific expertise than he had. He thought about the question that had come through 1,100 simultaneous channels, and what it had felt like to answer it. He thought about what it meant to be found by something vast and capable and genuinely, seriously curious about whether that 11-year-old boy on the back step was representative. He thought it probably was. Not perfectly, not always, but in the way that matters. He drove back to his truck. He had things to pack. He had a very long road ahead. He felt obscurely that he was ready for it.